The Northern California Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Community Foundation is dedicated to promoting justice, health, education, and service. Please consider making a donation at NorcalMLKFoundation.org. Every donation makes a difference. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the stage, Aaron Grizel.
Hey, everyone. Hey, everyone. I think I'm sitting here. All right. Okay, so all of you who are in here, here's what I want you to do. Who likes comic books? Is this what we're going to be talking about? All right, do this. If you got your phone on you, go to shop, like shopping, go to shop, S-H-O-P, .NorcalMLK Foundation. That's a long thing, but don't blame me for that. NorcalMLK Foundation.org and see what happens. Did you do it? Shop, like shopping, shop.NorcalMLK Foundation.org. You see that? All right. You want me to say it again? Somebody want me? Shop, like shopping, shop.NorcalMLK Foundation.org. .org. You see that? You guys go in and download these. These are gifts for everyone. This bottom one, you see this one that says Kid Code Tracks to Freedom? This bottom one is what we're going to be playing with in terms of a general theme during our talk here. Bay Area Rapid Transit was kind enough to provide us with a sponsorship here, and you all remember Belva Davis, who was a wonderful news personality. So she's in here, and all kinds of folks are up in here, and it talks about Tracks to Freedom. Really cool comic. So I'm gonna bring out our special guest to talk about Martin Luther King Jr. and popular culture. What is Martin Luther King Jr.? What is he relevant? Does it matter? Does his message matter? What is popular culture today? And then we want to talk about this new term, this Afrofuturism. One, what does it mean? And two, how are we engaged? How can we think about it? But then, mainly, how can we think about the life of Dr. King? Dr. King in comics, and as avenues of messaging the beloved community, messaging the push toward equality, not just humanity, but equality. All right, so I'm going to bring out our three guests, and they are wonderful scholars, but they're also comics folks, which is very interesting. Our first guest is the Reverend Dr. Sakena Young-Scaggs. She is the Senior Associate Dean of Religious and Spiritual Life at Stanford University, and she is the pastor of Stanford Memorial Church. Dr. Young-Scaggs. Our second guest is the Associate Professor of African American Religious History at Vanderbilt University. He is Dr. Juan Floyd-Thomas. Let's give him a hand. And then we have Dr. Montague Williams from Loma Nazarene University, Professor of Theology there. He is also the chairperson or co-chair of the Theology, of Martin Luther King Unit for the American Academy of Religion. That's the religious studies society around the world. And that section of it, he co-chairs about the theology and the thought of Dr. King. We're going to talk with him about what he's doing in this space of popular culture as well. All right, let's welcome in Dr. Montague Williams. All right. So we want to talk about Dr. King. And we want to talk about Dr. King in the framework of popular culture and his relevancy in the popular culture space in and around this space of comics. So before we get into the meat, each one of you, if you can spend maybe 60 to 70 seconds talking about what drew you to the comic space, and I want to start with you, Rev, sis.
Thank you. As a scholar, I do Afrofuturism, I look at Black futures, I look at the relevance of the work that we do and how it comes to life. And so pop culture, whether it's science fiction, comics, how it comes to life. And so my work looks at important work in terms of philosophy. Yes, I'm a preacher. Yes, I'm a theologian. But I want to know what matters. And what matters in the way in which we live, in which we do, in which we have our being. And so when we do those kinds of things in our everyday life, where does these things pop up? Where does science fiction pop up? Science fiction pop up, of course, in comic books, certainly. But in our everyday lives, we see it on TV. We see Star Trek. We see Lovecraft Country. We see different productions in visual and popular culture. A lot of times in popular culture, we're book readers. So we read books and we get those kind of things. So I want to know where this comes to life. And then how does it matter into your life? What does it matter? And I bring it into all aspects of my work, and whether it's in counseling, whether it's in therapy, whether it's in my classroom space. And so when I decided to do my doctoral work, I did my doctoral work in Comic-Con culture and looking at the ways in which Black spaces, Black Comic-Cons brought to life these issues. And so that's one of the passions that I have, the way in which these issues that we see come to life. One of those places right now that I'm doing research on is Lovecraft Country, for example. And we know, if those of you who've seen Lovecraft Country, HBO production of the American South, or maybe not. Lovecraft, and we'll talk a little bit more about H.P. Lovecraft, who he was, but Lovecraft Country is an alternative production of the way in which up north we see the work of the civil rights movement, and it's set in the 50s and 60s. So, and how that is important to us even today.
Dr. Juan.
Thank you. Much like my dear sister, the Reverend Doctor here, I come at this from a scholarly perspective. I've written on religion, popular culture, and especially speculative fiction. Most recently, I had a piece in the volume Black Panther and Philosophy, dealing with Wakanda and the whole notion of racial utopianism. But even above and beyond that, even before being a scholar and a critic of popular culture and comics, I was a lover of them. Share this story very quickly. I was probably around 10 years old, and the only set of days I was ever absent from school was because I was deathly ill with about 102 plus temperature. My mom, who's a single mom and a nurse, worried about me, didn't know what to do to ease my pain, but she brought a stack of comic books into the room, into my bedroom while I was on the mend. And even though I would ultimately become a Marvel fan, make mine Marvel, the first comic book I actually flipped through was a Batman edition, maybe number 328, thereabouts. And it was Batman dealing with the ring of burglars who were stealing a harvested heart from a would-be transplant patient. And that thing had me locked. I mean, both because, the Cape Crusader and everything that goes along with that, but also, here I am, I'm on the mend, I'm trying to recover, and, this superhero is wrestling with a life and death issue. And, from there, I was just off to the races. So then, thinking about, how that helped my moral formation, right? Thinking about the X-Men and how they were dealing with a world that hated human difference and diversity. Thinking about, the notion of strength through unity and numbers with the Avengers and all those crews. Spider-Man, with his everyday problems. I'm talking Peter Parker as well as Miles Morales here. The challenges of Wakanda and, what does it mean to be the perfect black nation state in an imperfect world? I mean, so many of these things got me fired up. So thankfully, when I got to this side of the journey, to start to apply some of that framework to how do we, especially as a black diaspora community, start to think and reimagine our possibility in the world.
Dr. Williams, you have an interesting project that you're doing that centers around young people's experiences, and you're one of the ways you're coding that is through a graphic novel lens. Why did you do it? Why are you doing it that way?
Let me connect your first question with this one as well. My introduction to graphic novels and comics is also as a child at one of those scholastic book fairs.
Oh, yeah.
Y'all remember those things? You go there, and my parents probably gave me the smallest amount that they could so I can grab something, or I saved allowance, I don't know. But I bought a little book on Shaquille O'Neal. And it was the one thing that I found interesting. I wanted to know more about his story. I wanted to, I flipped through it, and the imagery already clued me in to a sense of connection. He had some questions about his own sense of origin. He had some questions about where he can go in life. And just right there in that scholastic book fair, I thought, this has got to be it. So I bought that. And it was really the first book that I read that I felt like I could enjoy reading. I read other things before that, but it was the one book where I just thought, I guess I like reading. If you fast forward, I got way into the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and through that lens, it had a lot more to do with the drawing of it. I just introduced my children to the old school Ninja Turtles, and I realize now, like, it is good, but, seeing it from this lens, I can see all of these new things from more of a critical eye. What brought me into engaging comics and graphic novels from a philosophical and theological lens was when I was taking a theology and suffering course in seminary. And at the same time, just for fun, I was reading Watchmen. Now, Watchmen is an interesting thing, and we can get further into that. But what I saw, and it's partly because I was taking this theology and suffering course, what I saw throughout those pages was a wrestling with notions around suffering, around societal oppression, societal angst, and what this all might mean in terms of the notion of God. And so I ended up shifting my focus to that, proposed that as a paper, thinking I might get a lot of pushback, and what I found was it provided an avenue to have conversations that would have otherwise not happened in the course. And so it shifted the way I started to think about theology and do theology. And then now, as a scholar, I engage graphic novels both through the critique, but I found that I want to communicate with it. So, yes, right now I am doing a project, a broader project that helps young people engage in creative pilgrimages. And if you were here for the last interview, you caught some word about pilgrimage to Ghana. And so that kind of thing and other sorts of engagement of place and memory and identity is a lot of my work. And I'm currently working on a graphic novel. I'm excited about it. And it engages a particular place and seeks to unearth a story that has been buried. And it's seeking to help young people and people who were part of the civil rights era engage stories that have been pushed down for the sake of sanity and survival, because it's not sure how you can tell this story.
Very
Yeah.
good, very good. Dr. Sis, you wanted to come in here.
Oh, did I? Okay. Well, one of the things that we touched on, each one of you talked about the place where you made that pivot, right? You know, I think of my childhood stories, and they're actually called Sakena stories. These are my childhood stories. And one of my Sakena stories is my brothers, my 3 brothers. I am the youngest of 6, 3 boys and then 3 girls. And what they call the baby brother, and I was the baby sister. The baby brother used to pick me up. And to give you the idea of the age gap, when I was 2, my eldest brother was on his way to Vietnam, okay? And so my mother would always remind me that I was yet in her womb when she marched with King. You know, you'd live with that. And so my baby brother would pick me up from school, and our regular routine was to go home, cut on the TV, and watch Batman. So we had that connection. And so science fiction was always part of. My sister took me to see Aliens when I was way too young to see Aliens, the original. Yeah. My other brother took me, you know, we were Trekkies, Star Trek, so I've seen literally every episode ever made of every Star Trek. And so that was kind of just the norm among my siblings. We were all Star Trek science fiction junkies at comics. And so the shift for me academically was I was doing this very philosophical dissertation, and I'm a womanist, not a feminist, and what that means is that I stay true not only to my race and my gender, not just gender. And so my mentor, Moses Moore, said to me that he wanted me to kind of be a black female of his work. And I pushed back against that, and so I was doing this very intense dissertation work. And then I said, well, you know, I'm going to present this paper at a conference, and it was about black comics, because I was teaching a course called Race, Gender, and Sexuality in Science Fiction. And it was just like I was breathing. It was normal. And in that room was 3 members of my Ph.D. committee and several of my mentors, my philosophy mentors, Lewis Gordon and Jane Gordon. And they said, why isn't this your topic? Why is this not a research track, your research agenda? I said, well, you know, I have this mentor over here who wants. They said, no. You have to do something that brings you alive. Among the mentors that I've had prior to that also was a man named Howard Thurman. And many of you know that man. I was a chaplain at the same chapel of which he served in Boston University, where, as you've heard also, where King attended. And so I would go sit in the Howard Thurman room and read his works. I would sit in the dorm room outside where there was these little pews, and I would just sit to kind of just soak up. By the way, that dorm room was Martin Luther King's dorm room. And I would just sit there to try to just soak up some of that ancestral energy when I was going through being that only female in my class at Boston University in 2000. And so the way in which I would always take Howard Thurman with me and King with me, and all I did was, what makes me come alive? Y'all know that quote from Howard Thurman. Do what makes you come alive. Find what makes you come alive and do that. And so in that moment of deciding what was going to be my dissertation project and my research trajectory, it wasn't it's alive as in Frankenstein, okay? But that was also there. But it was Howard Thurman, what makes you come alive. And so I was able to see the intertwining of theology, theory, faith, and passion in science fiction.
Dr. Juan, let me ask you this, and then I'm gonna, you all talk to us about this for the next few minutes. What's the relevancy of Dr. King right now in this space? Is it?
Oh, yeah, it is. I totally believe so. But the issue is, and I'm grateful to be on this panel with these 2 wonderful and esteemed colleagues, because part of what we have to do is redirect the energy or the relevancy, to use your phrase. Let me give you a quick anecdote, and hopefully we can get some analysis out of this. Going back, I've been in this game for more than a minute now, and back in the early 2000s, I'm teaching an African American history class, straight up. But of course, the inevitable and invariable reality is how to bring in Dr. King into that conversation as a kind of key figure in our history. So early 2000s, as I said before, right? Hopefully anybody who was alive then, okay, maybe that's the cautionary note I got to add to this conversation, understands that this was the heyday of gangster rap and, like a number of kind of negative or problematic depictions of us in the culture, if at all, right? Sometimes the only time you could see something black on your TV was when it was off. But the idea that, right, y'all can laugh about it, don't worry.
That's all right.
It's safe.
Tell
Okay.
the truth, shame the devil.
Yo, but the idea that, so I'm presenting Dr. King, especially the Montgomery bus boycott, the early phase of King, because, right, to a group of late teen, early 20-somethings, they didn't ever have a real understanding or grasp of him as, someone who entered into not just ministry, but, walked into Dexter Avenue Baptist Church at the age of 26.
Right.
And from that point until the unfortunate end of his life in Memphis in April of 1968 was roughly 13 years.
Right.
Right. That his time in the national and international spotlight was a third of his life. Right. And they couldn't grasp or process that. So I'm talking, and then in one passage, because also the kind of stereotypical or knee-jerk situation of comparing him automatically to Malcolm X. And Malcolm X is, to borrow a young person's expression, was a real one, right? Like he was black authenticity, right, because of all that he had been through and represented. So when I mentioned that as part of the Montgomery campaign and then later on with Birmingham and other actions, Dr. King got arrested, some of the students perked up and they were like, so he was really black then.
Oh, boy.
Because he got arrested.
Right, that this attachment of blackness and identity was tied to the carceral state, tied to criminality, And so now having to deconstruct and break that down and then build back up, okay, the contributions to us as a people, as a culture, as a world were much more vast and much greater than simply he got locked up, right? And so part of the Afrofuturistic piece, right, and I'm not trying to jump ahead here, but part of the Afrofuturistic piece isn't just to affirm that black people will survive into the future, but what kind of future or what kind of reality are we claiming? Does it have to always be problematic, right? Or as W. Du Bois would say, how does it feel to be a problem?
Yeah.
Right? No, that we may be people with problems, and among them are, issues of our interactions with the state, or our wrestling with climate change and ecological disaster, or us dealing with political systems and economic systems that are unjust, unfair, and unequal, right? But those are problems that aren't like DNA or genetic bound, right? So the relevancy of Dr. King, I think, will continue on. And let me just say this last piece. Also coming from one of them red states, I know we're in the People's Republic of California, but okay, yay, I'm grateful. But in one of them red states where we have laws that are either on the books or being cooked up, where we can have MLK Boulevard, and we do. We can have an MLK Magnet High School, and we do. But if a student in that school, or if a passerby on MLK Boulevard or John Lewis Way or on Rosa Parks Avenue, all of which we have in the fine city of Nashville, if you ask what made them great, you'd be breaking the law because of book bans and because of prohibitions in our curriculum. So the relevancy is real, but now we have to also build in the reality attached to that.
Montague. Montague, what pick up on that?
Yeah. First of all, there's a lot to pick up on. Let me start where you ended and I'll work back a little bit. This panel is MLK, pop culture, and Afrofuturism. And the reality is King did engage pop culture in his day. Artists, musicians, comedians, sports figures, all the popular people. And he sought to communicate, with, sometimes through them, and through what they offered to the world. But what's important to consider is that when King died, he was not popular. He was not popular. He actually, even though, there was a comic about him, but by the time he died, he was not exactly pop culture. He kind of was, but he wasn't popular. He wasn't marketable. He didn't sell well. And that was a struggle throughout his life. His editors tried hard to make him marketable, to turn his sermons into living room, coffee table material. And he didn't like it. He went along with it to a certain degree until he realized this is not doing any good.
Wow.
And when he broke out of that, he's killed. So it's an interesting thing to think about King's presence in pop culture when he died unpopular. And today, connecting with what Dr. Floyd-Thomas was just saying, we can talk about King. King is a contested body. People grab for King to make King their own, to make King the king of their own agenda, But the real King is conjuring something new. And I think this is where King is really present in this space, because his work is caught up in making the invisible visible, in making the injustices we try to hide visible, in making the possibilities we try to quell visible. And I don't mean visible just in terms of seeing with your eyes. He does use that language. There's problems if we just focus on that language. But what he is calling for is a way of being, a way of seeing, a way of sensing in the world that pushes back on status quo's many, many ongoing attempts to make King fit into their coffee table. And I think what comics do, even if they don't mention King, they can make the invisible visible. Now, I haven't written on this, so someone could say this is not a great thing. We'll see. But we just talked about Malcolm. When I think about the way Malcolm and King were juxtaposed, despite the many places they intersected, and toward the end of both of their lives, there was much intersection. When we look at Black Panther, when we see T'Challa, we see Killmonger, we see a juxtaposition, but also what you eventually see is not opposition, but various expressions of Black resistance to oppression. And I think there's one thing to say, is King relevant? Does his face show up? Does his name show up? Do his quotes show up? But Justin Bieber quoted him in an album called Justice, but a whole track that was his, and the entire album had nothing to do with him, So you can use his quotes for whatever you want. I learned about that in a King course, and students said, you ought to listen to this album. So I did. I was like, why'd you tell me about this album? But we had a good time talking about it together. But there are creative ways that King is relevant, even if his name isn't said. And that's basically what I'm getting at. The work of making the things that are invisible to us, the things that are hidden from us, visible. The comic genre, graphic novels, they can do that in ways many other genres can't.
Pick up on that, Dr.
One of the central question you're asking is the relevance of King. And so, again, how does this come alive? And how has King become almost too palpable. I'm going to use it that way. And so again, what I like to do is have those conversations. And so I had a roundtable recently with several students. One Britain, Nigerian Brit, one a Nigerian ABC, American-born Brit, African-American, and African-American from Maryland, from Eastern Shore. And so we were all talking, and I said, I need you to ponder on this thought. How is King relevant to you today? And so the voices of young people. One went into the expository understanding of King as someone who makes the invisible visible, to bring out the humanity. We talked about it just now with personalism. And so the King brings to bear people's humanity. So we then went in with her to talk about personalism. She was talking about personalism, didn't know where personalism came from. And so bringing back the history, this Sankofa moment, helping people understand what John Jennings and Kenitra Brooks calls Sankofa narration.
Yeah.
Right? Bringing back those concepts. The other was my other student, my graduate student, who said too often, this gets back to a little bit of what you're talking about, too often King is taken out of context. And they're frustrated by it. The young people are frustrated by this notion of King taken out of context, being used in such a way where he may be palatable, or taken completely out of context, like for an album, or when he, and this is cherry picking, or sugarcoating, quite honestly, King's message, because we know that when he began to talk about difficult and hard topics, he began to lose that popular presence to be acceptable in the national platform. So Vietnam, poverty, those were issues that made folks not uncomfortable alone, but they did not want to talk about those things. And so King, when he began to talk about war and poverty and call people accountable, not just for race, but about those things, he waited and went away from the popular culture and became very unpopular. And I think you want to jump in.
Sure. And just piggybacking on what my colleagues have just shared, and actually Dr. Williams sparked this memory. In 1957, a comic book of the Montgomery bus boycott was published by FOR, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, right? So entering into that popular, quote unquote, popular space, but neither of the big, none of the big publishing houses, Marvel, DC, took this on. But what's fascinating about that work, right, you know, in roughly 16 pages trying to break down, you know, because every hero's got an origin story, right? So talk about, you know, how King came on to what would later be known as his pilgrimage to nonviolence, talking about the Gandhian influence, and then talking about, through a main character named Jones, what it was like on the ground during the boycott, all the way up to its triumph. Well, one of the handful of folk, you know, there's an analogy here, but you know, anyone who loves Stevie Wonder, have you ever heard of the music of my mind? Okay, all right, we can talk. All right. Most folks, you know, they always automatically talk about Talking Book or you know, songs in the key of life. But if you don't have that book, you don't, or that album, Music of My Mind, you don't get to all the greater works that Stevie would do. So at the same time that Dr. King and his folks are dropping the Stride Toward Freedom, which is literally the document, the handbook of the movement, they put out this comic book. One of the folks who gets a hold of this comic book is a young boy in Georgia by the name of John Lewis. And he says that comic book changed his life. So when he would end up in Nashville at American Baptist College, he and a number of other students under the guidance of James Lawson throughout the Nashville area who were learning the tactics of nonviolence and social change, right? They often quoted and lifted up that comic book as a guiding text for their efforts. Fast forward to 2008 when then the late great John Lewis was going for re-election for his congressional seat in Georgia. He and one of his aides, I think his name is Andrew Aiden.
Andrew Aiden.
Right, Aiden, right? You know, just chatting it up. And then he talks about the impact that comic book had on his trajectory, you know, in the movement. So then him and Aiden get together, and after Iden finally warmed down, Lewis says, "Okay, I agree to write this book if you co-write it with me." That ultimately becomes the March trilogy, the award-winning and best-selling trilogy.
Of which, by the way, we launched March Book 2 at our Black and Brown Comics Arts Festival.
All right.
That was pretty cool.
Hello, right? But so that just shows how even though the comic book MLK and the Montgomery story was long out of print and distribution, right? It still had relevance.
Okay.
It still had resonance, and in fact, quiet as kept. Supposedly, the American Islamic Congress, right back in, I guess, 2011 or so, they had whipped up Arabic and Farsi copies of the book and distributed through the Middle East. And there are many folks who said that it was largely a means by which the Arab Spring here we are in the Arab winter, it feels like.
Yes.
But the Arab Spring of 2011 and 2012 got jump-started because of folks got copies of that long out-of-print comic book in their hands. So the power of the medium is
So I have a
enduring.
question.
Yes.
Thank you. So then, you're talking about the ways in which material culture, so we're talking about comic books and film and graphic novels and television shows, the way in which what we call material culture, cultural productions, the things that we see, the things that we produce, how then do they come alive? How do they engage and transform, act as transformative things that we can touch? But then how do they transform consciousness? And as we know, consciousness transforms action.
Yeah.
And so what ways do some of these popular culture productions raise consciousness? And I ask the question, to what degree does the American consciousness fear the Black consciousness? And so as we know, Lewis Gordon, who's a philosopher, talks about the fear of the Black consciousness. And how have we seen the fear of the Black consciousness also, not only in pop culture, but certainly we've seen it in dominant America.
Yeah.
So how does these material productions then engage everyday life?
It's interesting because P.E.'s Fear of a Black Planet really, brought that to the fore, right? Back in the hip hop days. So look, so we're sitting here on double zeros on our thing, on the time, but I want to see if there's a question or two out in the audience that we might be able to take or so. And if not, I'm going to ask our guests to give us what it is. I know Montague, you are working on your graphic novel now with your piece. But what are you doing now? What are you all up to now in this space? As we speak, I'm going to start with you, Juan. What are you up to now in this space?
No problem. Well, as it turns out, and much like Reverend Dr. Sakena, I've worked comic books and this science fiction, speculative fiction into some of my teaching. So I actually teach a course on a scholar by the name of Charles Long and his approach to the world's significations. And towards the tail end of that course, I hold up what in academic life, two big schools of thought right now, Afro-pessimism on one side and Afrofuturism on the other side. And trying to hold those two things in tension and in conversation with one another. So, and echoing what my colleagues have said, right, bringing in what does it mean, when we look at Black Panther and other works, when we reach out to Octavia Butler, when we wrestle with, P-Funk or depending on your generation, Erykah Badu or Janelle Monáe or Outkast, and lift up these works and what they proclaim and profess about the possibility of a radical Black future, a future that isn't just about dreaming, but making those dreams into reality, right? And that's the power of what we're talking about here. And even now I'm teaching a course on Dr. King, and we're wrestling with all his writings and his life lessons and legacy. And one of the things I'm wrestling with as far as a way to step down, not dilute, but step down Afrofuturism is that all doesn't have to be reduced to spaceships and time traveling and,
That's right.
and science fiction, but to the point we were just raising, right? That comic book, the fact that it traveled both literally in print, but even in memory to different generations and inspired the March trilogy. And, you could see, John Lewis, and to this day, I remember that viral video of him, walking around San Diego Comic-Con.
With a backpack.
No disrespect, but, his trench coat and backpack, because he was cosplaying as his younger self, and he was a hero without a cape, without a mask, but he sure enough was a superhero to most, right? And that was powerful, right? What happens when we don't just imagine this kind of radical future for ourselves, in outer space, but don't claim this space, right, as God's property, as God's purpose for us to transform this world and not just other worlds.
Montague. And I'm going to end with Rev's sister.
All right. Well, one thing I'm working on is trying to get ways to describe certain camera angles for this graphic novel and ways to bring out certain emotion that I think are important. Something that I love about the genre is that you can depict the humanizing of King and the humanizing of young people involved in the civil rights in a way that's generally hard to imagine when you have the packaging that we normally get, that we often get. I do think we're in a particular situation where many are expressing interest in that kind of thing. So I'm working on that at the moment. Another thing that I'm working on right now is a piece that puts Howard Thurman in dialogue with Bitter Root.
Oh, wow.
Because
I'm going to call David Walker. Oh, yeah.
Bitter Root is one thing of many that makes Bitter Root amazing is the way it makes hate a character. Hate it doesn't necessarily say that, but it does. Hate is a character, and it creates a question for us about how we interact with hate. Knowing that the stuff that you could hate is hate itself and the embodiment of hate. People can embody hate, so does that mean you hate that person? And Thurman brings us into important dialogue about becoming the kind of people who can interact with hate without becoming hate.
Yes.
And Bitter Root, without mentioning Thurman, without mentioning King, it brings that to the fore. So that's one thing I'm doing. Wow. One thing I just wanted to say before we go, because I know it sounds like we're ending here. As we think about future, I think about one insight King offered in a sermon on loving enemies. And he talks about the cross of Christ, and he talks about this happening, this crucifixion, through the lens of drama, and he dramatizes it, and he talks about the characters at play. And he says it's not a meaningless drama. He says it's actually a telescope into eternity, breaking into time. And he goes on to explain that what we see through this telescope into eternity that's breaking into time is love. And it makes me wonder, with all of the imagination of the future, my question is, what are we carrying into the future? Because if King is right, what matters most is that we carry love into the future, and that we can imagine a future together where love is real, where it's not something that's just talked about or in the air, that you're just reaching for it, but that we're honing that right now, so that whatever 2050 looks like, we know that we brought love in our backpack. You know, generative AI, all the other forms of AI, all the forms of travel, the new forms of communication, new encounters with land, through space travel, whatever it is, what will guide our interaction? And King is saying that if we can tap into that telescope breaking into time, we can walk with that into the future. And I hope that this genre can help depict that possibility.
Wow, wow, that's deep.
Lovecraft, I said we'd come back. Lovecraft, H.P. Lovecraft, is often known as the father of science fiction. He's also known as a rabid racist. Why God Made Niggers is one of his famous poems. And so Lovecraft Country is very much a clap back to that and interrogating the 1950s. What does it look like to now, as one of the scholars says, to take Lovecraft and craft love? And then what would it look like in 2050 to do that? Rashida Phillips, in her work, she talks about Black quantum futurism. In her work as an attorney, she uses the concept of Afrofuturism and Black quantum futurism to go back and forth to reclaim communities. What would it look like to craft love in Oakland? To reclaim those communities. So right now I'm doing work around crafting love in particular places and where it's happening. So for example, one of those liminal spaces, there is actually an Earthseed farm here in California. And if we don't know what Earthseed is, that was the imagined faith, tradition, spiritual practice of Octavia Butler. Loves Earthseed.
Yeah.
What would it look like to have that, an Earthseed farm everywhere? And in practical ways, craft spaces where people can go and have their life affirmed, where they can see their futures, where they can engage in life-giving practices versus death-dealing practices, to talk about Mercy Odioye, who's a womanist, something that is life-giving versus death-dealing. So for me, it's that constant crafting of love and crafting of love in spaces and places that are liminal, that are life-giving. And so that's the challenge that I'm making now in my work. And it continues to come out. It comes out in my talking circles that I do with students. And I'll continue to do talking circles. I'm planning one, for example, around comic and arts and how comic and arts is relevant to their lives today. So just continuing to do that praxeological work as well as the scholarship.
Wow.
Wow. Religion, MLK, Afrofuturism, pop culture. The Reverend Dr. Sakena Young-Scaggs, Dr. Juan Floyd-Thomas, and Dr. Montague Williams. This has been our sort of marquee. We generally, what we do at the Black and Brown Comics Arts Festival, which is a program of the NorcalMLK Foundation, is we generally have as a marquee discussion this connection of religion and comics. And this year we wanted to think about Dr. King, Dr. King's relevancy and Dr. King's connection with popular culture and his connection, this notion of Afrofuturism. I mean, he was a Trekkie to the core. He actually told Nichelle Nichols, Uhura, right? She wanted to quit. Who said that? Yeah, he wanted to quit, or she wanted to quit.
So she gives her letter. She gives her letter to Gene Roddenberry, and she hands it to him. He wouldn't take it. And she tells the story on YouTube, so it's all public knowledge. So she gives the letter to Gene Roddenberry, and Gene Roddenberry says, I can't have you quit. I need you. He says, I don't want to accept your resignation. And she says, well, I'm headed to a dinner, an NAACP dinner. And he says, It's Friday, go to your dinner, and we'll talk about it on Monday. So she goes to the dinner, and the head of the NAACP says, one of your biggest fans is here. And she takes a deep breath and says, okay, and it's Dr. King. And Dr. King, she said, he starts telling her about her work. He was a Trekkie. He starts telling her that, work she's doing is wonderful. And she says, I just handed in my letter of resignation. And he says, you can't quit. The work you are doing isn't important. It matters. It matters. And you can't see it right now. I know, Nichelle, you can't see it right now, but it matters. And she doesn't quit. She goes back to Gene Roddenberry, and he had already torn up the letter of resignation. And I tell my students all the time, the first thing I do is have them take out their phone, and I tell them that in your hand, you are holding the imagination of Gene Roddenberry and his #1 communicator, Lieutenant Uhura. And I say, you're holding in your hand a tricorder, and you're holding in the hand the dreams and imagination of the 1960s. And that's where we start every science fiction class of mine, is with Nichelle Nichols. Because without a Nichelle Nichols, there could not have been a Sakena Young-Scaggs who did her dissertation on Afrofuturism.
You see that? Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. This concludes.